Right. Thanks for having us today.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
So Andrew and I are relatively new to the fence. I've only been working in this area for about a year, and most of this year has been spent trying to figure out like who the stakeholders are and where my place might be. So I'm an archaeologist and historical ecologist, and I work on creating what we call usable and applied archaeologies, and I'll explain that further in the presentation. Um, and Andrew, he's an artist. He'll also talk. He highlights how humans kind of shape, change the environment and the world through his work. So we're now working together uh, and are attempting to bring a project to life that combines archaeology, art, material culture, and the kind of natural and cultural heritage of the fence. So the presentation will be about the beginnings of the project. I'll talk a bit about my goals, and Andrew will talk about some of his aims and kind of the bigger framework in which it fits. Uh, so a lot of it will be how archaeology can help inspire and provide ideas about the future management of a landscape, or at least I hope so. And you can see here on the subtitle the tagline that we use to think through about how we're approaching this is food for people, food for the land. And the theme of like human nature entanglement is running through the presentation. Um, So understanding that humans are not separate from nature, but very much part of it, is really necessary to kind of get around landscape histories to visualize how we've shaped them, lived in them, how we experience them. Essentially, landscapes are cultural, and humans either cared for them or occasionally not. Uh, but because of this, human presence in nature is not bad by default. And here I also mean by extension the plants and the animals, domesticated or wild or semi-wild, that humans have intentionally or unintentionally propagated. So some of the most cherished and biodiverse landscapes that we have in the world are the result of this human-environment interaction. One of these is the Amazon rainforest, where you have these fertile, dark soils where you have archaeological sites. They're anthropogenic. And on in the middle picture, you see kind of this forest, which again is there because of indigenous forestry practices. Similar with the African savanna, kind of this big, massive landscape where pastoralist communities have created these nutrient hotspots, these circles that you see from abandoned settlements, which then attract grazers, other animals, or on the top right there, these uh, forest islands in West Africa. And coming back to the UK, a good example of human created and maintained biodiversity for about 1,000 years is the strip farming system. So on the slide here, top left corner, you have the vial in Wales, which is fortunately and unfortunately practiced uh, for conservation rather than food production by the National Trust. But we know that strip farming continues to be practiced, most notably in Laxton. But I'm sure you know that better than me. The bulks and the breaks between the fields act as highways for insects, rodents, other animals to travel, but also provide space for meadow plants and bushes. And with the enclosures, these strip field systems disappeared, but hedgerows emerge, which are now also hugely important wildlife habitats. Um, and to make these relationships really visible and valuable in terms of how we perceive and treat the environment socially and what action we can take, I think archaeology can be a really important tool. So I'll highlight here the studies by the NGO Climate Outreach, and the work that they've done kind of really shows that successful communication about the impacts of climate and environmental change, uh, and how communities and stakeholders, how they see their capacity to take action, to get results, uh, kind of the stories we build around it need to include local histories, they need to connect to the local landscape, and create a sense of community among people. And a particular challenge we have in this is kind of the shifting baseline syndrome, so where every generation has a new normal and also what they consider acceptable change in terms of the environment, the landscape. And in effect, so when people see these, what are long-term changes, they see them as minor instances in their lifetime, but also changes over 2 or 3 generations are perceived then as taking place or taking further and further back. So instead of just 2 lifetimes ago, it's like hundreds and hundreds of years ago. But archaeology makes a great communicator and a great narrative tool to tell the story about social and cultural and environmental change, because it makes the past tangible. You can essentially touch it through the materials that are dug up or the ruins that are still there. So it brings the past into the present and decreases that temporal distance as part of the shifting baseline syndrome. And the remains that we have, they always talk about local histories. People use them to build links to local identities. People draw on these things. And we also have a huge audience. So cultural museums, archaeological sites, they're some of the most visited attractions globally because they have that interest. And kind of this archaeology is a tool for that. I know it works. So the bottom picture there is from my previous project in Kenya, where this type of work, it reinvigorated interest in use of traditional objects, practices, and it stimulated discussion about millet for farming because of the changing weather patterns, where maize, kind of more water intensive maize, is now being farmed pretty much everywhere. So because of this, I don't believe archaeology is just about the past, but it can be used to rethink the present and the future, which is when we kind of get these usable and applied archaeologies that I mentioned before, which are aimed at addressing modern social and ecological issues. So a lot of it is about addressing sustainability issues with, for example, managing biocultural heritage. So having a more direct application, like to the vial that I showed before, but it hasn't been used as much as a communication tool that can help us re-envision the futures that we want and how to manage that, which is what we want to do here. So, or I want to do here. Andrew also wants to utilize that. So use the past as a guidance and inspiration to allow for biodiverse and, importantly, productive management of the land to create food for people, for animals, plants, and soils. So we want to bring a tangible past to life that decreases the distance between the past and the present and makes potential futures kind of feel a bit more real and inspire action by building on the present situation and making the goal feel reachable. What we don't want to do is make it feel like a big leap to the next step. And all of this we want to couch within the framework of environmental improvement and stewardship schemes so that there is an economic incentive as well. That incentive is really important, as my colleague Rachel Bangalore from Land Economy Cambridge.
Can you pick up some milk on the way back?
No, Rupert, I think you need to mute yourself. Yeah. And sorry, to be able to do all of this,
well,
we know we will depend on the process of co-production with the land stewards, need to get their buy-in and figure out with them what would work and where there is space for this. We need to create a narrative framework that speaks to their cultural values, draws on their experience and adds to it, and allows them to bring in their own family and farm histories into this framework. And art here is really important in how this story is, or this framework is visualized and implemented. And any results that we'll get and guidance, should be implementable, should be easy to follow. And the way we think about it is through cascades and how small steps and the introduction of one practice or one species cascades multiple benefits down the line. So I've added here an image of the recent Wicken Fen outreach that Fenscape's done on the 1st of June as this poster of beetles that are commonly found in archaeological record, but aren't there present that much anymore. But for example, by introducing certain plants or certain of these insects, how they would attract rodents and birds that eat them and help the soils, for example. So thinking through some of these and what practices help maintain these species. And there are two interrelated projects for application. One we've called Field Kitchen. We've applied for funding, received really good feedback from the AHRC, but then just weren't successful, which annoying. But we're continuing our search with this. So field search for funding for this. So the project is about exploring and experiencing the food heritage of the fens, but kind of reimagined for today. So not doing medieval cooking, but thinking of cooking with those ingredients, including potential wild foods, and doing modern recipes or rethinking how food shapes the landscape. So it's inspired by the Kitchen Collaboratory as a community space for engagement, to think through biodiversity, sustainability issues, and how food plays a role in this, and where the benefits might be for the people and other living things, all through land managers' input. And it builds on the cultural value of the fens as feeding the nation and links in the landscape's past, which for thousands of years has been about food economies. And domesticated plants are the most common botanical remains found in archaeological records. So there is that connection between the past and the present. Here on the right, you can see some of the commonly found plant species and animals. And an art-based approach would deliver many outputs, including recipes, manuals on plants and what they contribute to each landscape through those cascades mentioned before, and just help envision everything. And following on from that and building on ideas from the field kitchens, working within these environmental improvement schemes and how they can deliver benefits and income beyond what countryside stewardship or biodiversity net gains already offer. So currently, and correct me if I'm wrong, I've been through the documents. There's no guidance on what a land should be restored to or improved to, kind of almost disregarding its history. All it says that I've seen is kind of it should be managed as appropriate for the land. But from the Lowland Peat Workshop, another engagement that I've done, we know that farmers really do value the history of the land and the heritage of the land. And we had great fun mapping some scenarios, kind of pulling that history and thinking about the future and what we want to see in the landscape. So that's that picture on the left with the map. And my colleague Reka Bangalkar, again, who conducted this farmer survey with the results on the right, found that many think that stewardship schemes kind of lack vision, lack a bit of purpose, which is where I think this narrative building of kind of bringing some of the past into the present, some of these using that as inspiration might work well. And a particular place for impact might be the drainage infrastructure, where there's potential for them to act as biodiversity highways like hedgerows and balsa strip farming, and which used to be managed in the past as well, as a place, as an economic place for people. And I'll pass on to Andrew now.
Andrew, I'm going to have to ask you to move quite quickly because we're already up to the 15 minutes, but if you can keep it reasonably short.
Yeah. Okay, I will do. I won't read everything out. And there might be noises of an airport in the background, so sorry about that. So yeah, essentially all of what Nick said, I am interested in and believe in, but I'm coming at it from a arts point of view. I kind of view environmental archaeologists as the sort of knowledge holders of landscapes that have been stripped by bioculturally and biocultural heritage and the ecosystems. Just very quick, my practice is based around creation of functional artworks, experimental systems that act as a foundational platform for others to use and inhabit. And I guess, the project that we are working on together is called Field Hospital. It's happening in the Fens and in just outside Oaxaca in Mexico, and in just outside in the Cape Town in the winelands in South Africa, and hopefully will be also taking place in Northern Ireland, Kenya, and Italy. But it's based off the disaster zone infrastructure that goes in. So field hospitals, which normally go into disaster zones and provide humanitarian relief, we are using that as a basis to try to bring landscape relief, essentially. How do I move to the next slide?
Just say next slide.
So this is your typical field hospital, and we'll be using it as a place for nursery and prototyping solutions for the landscape. But the first step for the project is the field kitchen stage. Next slide, please. Which again is kind of based off the infrastructure of disaster zones, but which provides food for people that are in the disaster zone. But for our version, it's essentially providing food for landscapes and asking what food does that landscape need to revive itself. Next slide, please. So it's kind of combining art, archaeology, and food to create these recipes, and those recipes act as blueprints to revive that landscape. Next slide, please. So this is just a reference image, but essentially just this idea of like looking at food in a different way and thinking about that food as like essentially sort of understanding what the foods were of the past, what things we're eating, not just humans, but other species as well. So like trying to get out of that human-centric point of view. And through that knowledge that we gain through the field kitchen, we provide the field hospital stage with the blueprint to enact the change. Next slide, please. Last slide. Slow disasters is like a core part of that idea. So the idea, it's a term that I came up with to describe landscapes that have been changed over a long period of time to the point that we don't even have a memory of what that landscape used to be like. And essentially with Nick and archaeology, we are going to rebuild that understanding of what used to be there to then have an understanding about how we can rebuild it in the future, or present and future. I'll end there.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks for being so brief. I know you had a lot more you could have said, but I'm very appreciative of that. So it gives us a few moments for people to ask questions. Fascinating from my point of view, and particularly in relation to the species from the past. I guess one of the questions I would have asked is if you did this exercise 300 years in the future, you'd be looking at invasive species in the fens just now, and whether or not you want to reintroduce invasive species. Be interested to reflect on. But Roger, you had a question.
Yes, thanks. Nick, I think I heard you say that, or it was written up, a lack of vision for looking at what we need, particularly in the fens. I'm not at all sure that's true, because there's a lot of us working, and we all have different visions, of course. The farmers have a different vision to the conservationists, to the recreationists, etc., etc. But your colleagues in the Centre for Landscape Restoration at the University of Cambridge are obviously working on this, and you probably know who they are. But of course, I understood what you said about moving baselines, and this is a real challenge. I mean, there are many big birds we would like back, which are found in the archaeological record, like great bustard and pelican. And unless we take down all these telephone lines, electricity lines, and pylons, and wind generators, they're going to just be decimated. So we have to take account of modern times as well. But yeah, I agree with you. I work on an extinct frog, which we could bring back, but we haven't got the water quality anymore. So again, we have the evidence that it was there, but we haven't got the modern habitats will not allow reintroductions. But and the other thing I was going to say was a lot of this should be dealt with by this land use framework, which is now being touted by others in the government. So this could account for different people's needs in a mosaic in the fens. But I really enjoyed what you said, Nick and Andrew. Thank you.
Yeah.
And let me just add for the lax vision part. I think that was how people perceive if I understood Reka correctly. That'll be the caveat. That's how also the policy, how people perceive the policy to be. So not that people themselves lack vision. They like we can find everything else. Of course, they have a vision of what they want to achieve, and they're doing it really well. But also, some of the replies within that also came from people who aren't within the countryside stewardship. So part of the reason why they're not in, they see it as lacking vision.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Matthew Bullock.
Two comments. One is I think that the concern that I have about the discussion about fens is it's always talked about a disaster. And it isn't actually. It's very lively and very active. And it's important that we don't sort of try to create ourselves back into kind of nostalgic history and restoration. It's got to work with what is there now. And the second thing is that we've actually got very detailed maps now for over 25% of the whole fen by field, by soil, by water, by productivity, by all these kind of things. We're trying to pick up the gas at the moment. But this data is already there. And somehow we're trying to go, these are land use frameworks, they're all sketches. And actually, none of these things are actionable. And the reason why we've been working with fenland soil is actually to look at individual fields with the farmers and say, what are we going to do with it? So I stop talking about these sort of sketches and get into the actual detail, because it's there and available to be working in, and create a future rather than somehow feeling we're going back into a past.
Oh, yeah, I don't want to go into a past, far from it. And I want to work with what's there in the present, is just like using like archaeology purely as inspiration. That's it. So if people want to kind of have a bit of that farming, which yes, 100%. I grew up on a farm. I still work with my uncle's farm. I like, that's in Slovenia, and I know the bollocking he gets from like the government, and it's like it's never, how to say, it's like somebody wrote something that's never been on a farm. So I fully get it. But it's kind of thinking, just taking that as an inspiration. So if we do want a specific birds, what were their ecological niches, and how might we then create those niches within land that's already, for example, set aside through countryside stewardship with minimal input, so that it's not an economic, so it's minimal cost to the farmers, but ultimately what you get, it's massive benefits down the line. That's really kind of, that is my.
Thanks, Nick. Final question on this stage from Helen.
Yeah, it's a quick question. I think the stories we tell, the narratives we tell to ourselves, to each other about the world and the communities in which we live are hugely important and are needed to counterbalance the dry policy technicalities, but the realities of how people make a living and live in times of economic and climate challenge. My question is actually quite a quick one. It's more about Flag Fen and Must Farm, and wondered if you were doing any work with those sites.
Yeah, so with the field kitchen, which we applied for, were unsuccessful for, they were part of the project. So yeah, we want to continue that relationship. And I mean, with I know that the department and Cambridge Archaeological Unit are doing within the next few years massive things with blackfin, which will be part of.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks both Nick and Andy. And thanks, I mean, the Helen's point about narratives telling a story, I think, and portraying issues is very powerful. And also, Andy, I think where you're using the term field, kitchen field, hospital, in order to have a metaphor that people can get their head around. Both good storytelling, I think, so as well as everything else. So thanks very much indeed for presenting this morning. I think also now we do have Nicola online, so Nicola can pick up on her piece, which looks fascinating as well, Medicines from Plants. Nicola, are you out there?
I am. Thank you so much, and I apologise
Not at all.
being late. Let me share my screen. Is that working for you? Can you see?
That looks good.
Brilliant. So thank you so much for having me. My name's Nicola Patron, and I work in the Department of Plant Sciences. I am a molecular biologist and geneticist, and biochemist. And in our research, we work on a number of different things to do with plants and engineering plants for the future. And one strand of our work is looking for bioactive natural products that plants make, particularly those that are useful for us in industry, in medicine, and in agriculture. And we're also interested in ways that we might be able to access these more sustainably. So plants are absolutely amazing chemists. They make a wide and diverse range of metabolites that allow them to adapt to their environments and communicate. So these will be used for doing things like attracting pollinators, repelling pests and pathogens, and also for modeling the microbiome and making them unpalatable to herbivores. So many of these molecules are also utilized by humans as flavors and pigments and fragrances and anti-insecticides, and also as pharmaceuticals, either directly or as precursors for chemical synthesis. So in many cases, or actually maybe it's not so much many cases, in a small number of cases, the bioactive molecule that's responsible for the bioactivity of a particular species has been identified, as it has been in these 8 species here. And in an even smaller number of cases, we also understand how the plant makes that molecule. But in most cases, that's not the case. We know that plants are bioactive, but we often don't know what molecules are responsible, and we have very little idea about how the plants make them. So even when that molecule is known, access can be very complicated. So many of these molecules have very complex stereochemistry, which means producing them as drugs means chemical synthesis can be very challenging. And that's why there's molecules such as a few chemotherapy agents that are purified from plants still and not made by chemical synthesis yet. We just simply are not able to do that in any cost-effective way. And even when we do then extract them from plants, they can be present in very low concentrations. They can be present in a very limited cell type, in complex mixtures. And worse, they can exist in plants that are difficult to cultivate or are very long-lived. So one of the chemotherapy agents that we're dependent on, it's on the WHO list of essential medicines, is Taxol, and it comes from the Pacific yew tree. It went through clinical trials in the 1980s and was approved as a chemotherapy agent. And in 1992, there's this lovely endearing article that says, once seen as worthless, the Pacific yew is our only natural source of Taxol, a powerful cancer fighting drug. Unfortunately, at that time, it was impossible to extract that from these long-lived and large trees in a non-destructive way. And in less than 20 years, that species was then the red list because we had harvested that almost to the brink of extinction. So we have got slightly better Taxol. There are better ways of obtaining Taxol. It is still extracted from Pacific yew trees, but now we're able to culture some of the cell types that make it and extract it in a slightly more sustainable way. But for other species, we still do have this problem. And while we're conducting discovery of rare species, this remains a challenge. So synthetic biology suggests that if we understand how the plant makes that, we can harvest the biosynthetic pathway, harvest the genes from that species, and then reconstruct that in another organism. And we can do things then engineering that organism to enhance the production of that organism. So most of this work to date has been done in microbes, and as I'll come to in a moment, this also may have sustainability issues. And so there is this point at the moment where we're thinking more about biological synthesis, which has been around for a long time for things like insulin, which is we used to harvest from pigs, but now we produce it by reprogramming yeast cells or bacterial cells to make the products we want. And we also do things for like the enzymes that we use in washing powder. We don't harvest those enzymes anymore. We reprogram a bacterial cell, we ferment that, and then we extract those proteins and we use them as ingredients. So an example of this that's been done more recently is vanillin. So vanillin is the dominant molecule responsible for the flavor of vanilla. It's been extracted from the seed pods of orchids for centuries, and of course it still is. And all 3 species of vanilla orchids are native to Mesoamerica, including what is now Mexico, but they've been bred and cultivated in other countries in the Indian Ocean island of Madagascar, being responsible for about 80% of global production. So in the 20th century, chemical synthesis of vanillin was enabled from cheap and widely available precursors. And then in the 21st century, the biosynthetic pathway was elucidated by a scientist at the Technical University of Copenhagen. And that enzyme then was licensed to a company called Evolver, and now they produce vanillin in yeast. So yeast is usually grown on a sugar feedstock that's typically derived from corn or sugar beet or sugar cane. And so this is where sustainability issues can come in. So this is an example of a large-scale yeast fermentation factory. This particular factory is owned by a company that is no longer in business, and it doesn't produce vanillin. It produces trans-beta-farnesene, which is used in a lot of chemical industries, emollients, creams, and medicines. But one of the things that worries me about the argument for this being sustainable is in order to be close to its sugar feedstocks, it needs to be somewhere where a lot of sugar is produced. And in this case, they chose to put this factory in Brazil, which in one perspective is good because they're not moving large amounts of sugar around, but of course the sugar is being grown in what once would have been rainforest. And I'm not entirely sure that even though trans-beta-farnesene used to be made from the petrochemical industry, that having it made where it used to be rainforest is better sustainability. So as I said previously, most of this work has been done in microbial production, and that requires some sort of feedstocks. And so there is quite a lot of efforts in growing things on more sustainable feedstocks, on using bacteria that can grow on carbon dioxide and or methane, and also on things like waste cooking oil. But what we do in our lab is we look at producing molecules in photosynthetic chassis, including plants themselves. So in my department, people are working on different things. Some people are working on algae, some people are working on liverworts, and we tend to work on vascular plants. And of course, the attraction of this is, even though they are slightly more difficult to engineer, they do, of course, just use light and water and carbon dioxide, which are abundant feedstocks. So what I want to do in the second part of this talk is just give you an example of a pathway that we've been working on recently. So we have been working on a plant which I hope will be widely recognizable to most of you, and that is Calendula officinalis, or pot marigold. So pot marigold has been used in traditional medicine since antiquity. antiquity. It's described by Pliny the Elder, and it's the way that it's used is that these outer ray petals are used to make a poultice that was used for wound healing. So it was actually introduced by Britain by the Romans as part of their medicinal toolkit for treating wounds, and it was used in this way right up until the First World War. So this lady, Gertrude Jekyll, is a garden designer, and during the First World War, she encouraged lots of the great houses around England to grow stands of marigold so that the petals could be harvested and sent to the field hospitals in France. And in the 1930s and 40s, these kind of medicines were removed from the British National Formulary because there wasn't good evidence for their bioactivity, but they are still present in a lot of creams and emollients. Nappy rash creams all contain calendula extracts. And then towards the latter part of the 20th century, when we were able to start doing bioactivity assays with different cell types, people were able to prove that these extracts were bioactive. And so when we picked up this project, we wanted to work on a UK plant that had been used in traditional medicine and identify what it was used for. So the first thing that we wanted to find out is whether, in fact, these plants are anti-inflammatory. So we collaborated with someone in a pharmacy department. So we worked with Maria O'Connell, who works at the University of East Anglia. And we did some extracts in some human cell lines. And the way that this assay works is you can have a basal level of expression of inflammatory cytokines. So this inflammatory cytokine is called interleukin-6 or IL-6. We can then stimulate ourselves with lipopolysaccharides, so we get a base level of inflammation, and then we can treat them with different things. So BAE is a positive control. It's a drug that we would expect. It's a purified drug. We know how much we should expect inflammation to go down, and we can also see that it goes down quite significantly when we add our extracts. We can also profile what's in our extracts, and so this is what's called gas chromatography, mass spectrometry. It's not super important. The most important thing that I want to tell you here is that there are classes of compounds or triterpenoids that we find here that are enriched in these ray petals that are not present in other parts of the plant, and that we can hypothesize for being responsible for that bioactivity. Another reason to suggest that these triterpenoids are in fact bioactive is that very recently, why are my slides not moving? Here we go. Very recently, a product had come onto the market, a topical gel that has a base of a few different triterpenes. So they're also triterpenoids, same class of molecules, but a different identity to the ones that we find in our extract in a base of refined sunflower oil for treating chronic wounds. So this is a prescription medicine for people who have wounds that don't heal over many months or years. And so then the next step that we do is we look at our extracts and we look at all the triterpenes that are in there, and we can test each one of these molecules individually, and we can determine what exactly is responsible for this anti-inflammatory activity. And so we tested this first group of compounds, and we can see these are not particularly anti-inflammatory. But the second group of compounds, which are characterized by this little group here, this gray group, we can see that these are quite bioactive, and it doesn't change too much when we add other things. So what's important is these particular ones here are these ones here, which are present at a very, very low concentration in our marigold plants. Which brings us back to this being difficult to extract and utilize them in an easy way. So we also compared the bioactivity of one of these key molecules, which is chlorfuradiol, to the bioactivity of the constituent components of this product that's already on the market, and we were able to see that it was indeed more inflammatory. So that was also pressed us to doing more in this direction. So then the next thing we knew, we need to be able to find those pathway genes. And the way we go about doing this is we can look at the metabolome, we can look at the genome, and we can look at the transcriptome. So here we've got all the genes that are present in the genome, and then we can compare this profile that we can see that they're expressed in some tissues that not others. We can also then look at the genes that are expressed in some and not the others. And we can make hypotheses of the type of genes that we are looking for from the shape of this molecule. So this is the molecule that we're looking for. We know that this is likely going to be made from this linear precursor molecule. So we know that we're going to look for a type of gene that we know can stitch this linear molecule up into these 5 little rings. Then we know that we need to look for a gene that's able to stick on this group that we know adds bioactivity. And then for the final step, that adds on this long tail, which is a fatty acid tail, which we believe helps entry into the cell cycle. And so the way then that we can characterize these, we test our genes, we put them into a bacteria that's able to infect the plant that we use for testing, but also in scaling up production. And then we can check whether this plant is making our new molecule or not. And so to cut that long story quite quickly, we can see that we can find these 3 genes for this pathway. When we express the first gene here, don't worry about the names, we can see that we find the first part of the molecule. When we express the first and second gene, we can see that the second group has been added on, and we express all 3, we find our active molecule. We can then compare the yield that we are getting in our production plant, and we can find that it's about 9 or 10 times greater than we are getting in the native plant. So there are things that we can do to increase this. So the things that we're doing next, our colleagues in the pharmacy department are going to further investigate activity and efficacy using human skin cell lines and models and look at that mechanism of action. Those things would be required to be able to make a formulation that could be used as a drug. And we ourselves are moving on to look at other molecules that are found in other plants that we commonly find or grow around the UK. So things like yarrow, lettuce, and white bryony all produce very interesting molecules that we think can be used as either drugs or will be useful in agriculture. And then finally, we're also looking at tailoring our plant for production, and we're working with colleagues at the John Innes Centre in Norwich and the Royal Holloway University of London, and also with a very interesting company, Bridge Farm, who are just outside of Swaffham, who are growing our plants at large scale to help us to be able to purify these compounds and do a life cycle analysis to see how sustainable our production pipeline will be. So I will finish there and just thank everybody that's been involved in this project and our funding agencies. And I'd just like to say, if anyone's around on Saturday, we're going to be talking about this as well at the Festival of Plants in the University Botanic Gardens.
Nicola, thanks so much. Again, absolutely fascinating and some really, really interesting kind of explanation, but also some questions to ponder. Particularly one that's hit up in my mind was the dilemma in Brazil about production, about synthetic variants of the plants. Any questions for Nicola? Nicola, I think everyone's still reflecting completely on what you've had to say, and thank you very much as well. I think I might make my way down to the Botanical Gardens on Saturday just to listen.
It's lovely to see you there if you're around.
Definitely, it's a lovely day. So thank you very much indeed for being with us this morning and for that contribution.
Thank you.
Next up is, if she's with us, is Catherine Grundy from Brighton University. Catherine, you're going to talk, I think, about nature trails and public engagement, which is a very live subject, obviously, at Natural Cambridgeshire, when we're working with open spaces and public use.
Hi, yes, I am here. I'll just share my screen. Thank you for inviting me along. Can you see that?
Yep, we can see it. Thank you.
Great. All right, lovely. So yes, as you said, I'm Cate Grundy. I'm from the University of Brighton. I'm going to talk to you about interactive trails that can attract people to natural environments or historical sites, actually. The first speaker prompts me to say, directing them to important areas, making the information there more accessible and inclusive to wider audiences, and, you know, for things like rewilding projects, for example, but most importantly as well, to get people to respect the land in a place, in a landscape. So yeah, I'm an academic and researcher at the University of Brighton, but I'm also a practitioner. After my doctorate, I started a company, Friendly Fox Design, to create interactive trails and boards based on my research. My doctorate was all about how to encourage young people to engage with natural environments. My focus is very much on user-centered design with communities, children and stakeholders at a site. So the first thing we created, sort of partnership with local animators and artists, were children's augmented reality trails. So revealing characters and activities and stories using web AR, working with, it's kind of like a digital forest school, I suppose, although we, you know, children have the device, they actually have to sort of interact with the environment, and it's kind of gamifying the process and sort of adding interest. So we worked with children to look at their emotional needs and understand how to try and overcome those barriers to sort of playing out in local parks and so on. They were co-designed with Forestry England. We also worked with the Wildlife Trust, and we worked with, most importantly, with SEN children at a forest school called Develop Outdoors. They've been implemented in several parts across the UK. Now, I have to say, we have, in the feedback, come across some tech skepticism, which is, you know, children using devices. However, you know, our research showed, and I think you're probably all aware, that sort of children over 7 in particular become averse to sort of engaging in natural environments. You know, there's statistics like they spend less time playing outdoors than prisoners in the UK and things like that. And there are a lot of social and cultural barriers. So we were just trying to look at what are those enticements really. So we just kind of realised we were missing quite an important audience there, though. You know, most children, adults have some kind of say, at least, in what they actually do. But more importantly, adults influence policy, community action. And we came across these statistics, which is that 80% of people are concerned about climate change, but actually only 40% were worried about the decline in natural species. And the references are there. And obviously there's a sort of a disconnect between how nature does influence climate as well, and how nature is a great barometer for some of the sort of the wider issues. So we were particularly interested in places so where people and nature collide. So the evidence is that 92% of people engage in natural spaces for their health and well-being, and I think those figures have increased since COVID, when people kind of realised the benefits. You know, they might see a natural space like a beach as a recreational space, or, you know, a dog walking location. You know, there are, you know, just facts, there's 12 million dogs. People walk them in nice locations. About 85% of dog owners admit that they let the dog off the lead, even when they're not supposed to. You know, and they, you know, there's the kind of human interest. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that's wrong. Sometimes it's actually good leverage, as which I'll come to later. But we realised that interpretive signs were not very accessible a lot of the time. So, you know, what we wanted people to see was what we're actually sharing a space with. You know, and they're not kind of just our space to enjoy the kind of the home of lots of different creatures. And we wanted to sort of also communicate how our activities can impact an environment. So we also kind of started working on these interpretive signs that actually show videos, show animation, you know, that things that are more accessible, things that are more entertaining, things that are more enjoyable for people to assimilate. So just to kind of demonstrate what I'm actually talking about, I'm hoping this is going to work. I don't know how to do the sound, but I won't worry about that. Sorry, let me start that again. Flicked over it. So it's a little bit, the picture is not great, but you get the picture, so. So it's very simple. I think I'll have to, I don't know how to click off of that now. Oh,
The smallest of our UK towns. They measure between just
Sorry. I think there's something happened to my Miro board. Here we are. Sorry, I can't seem to get out of this. Hang on, let me do that. No, oh no. Sorry, this was so easy on Teams. I normally use Teams. Let me start. Let me come out of the presentation and move on to the next slide. Oh no. Okay, right. Sorry about that. I'll present from here. Okay, so I'm not expecting to test any on this later, but just to kind of talk briefly about flow theory, which is what our one of the models that we used to sort of create the principles of the boards and the design guidelines for them. We were adapting this model, but also combining the 5 pathways, Professor Miles Richardson. So the flow theory was originally invented by Chicks Make Me High. And it really talks about why we become immersed in something and why we engage with it. It's been used sort of extensively across media and games. And here's some of the main principles: the appropriate levels of challenge, feelings of control, which is why we continue to engage with something, concentration, clear goals, and relatedness is something that I've added, which is very much about the branding of nature, which sounds superficial, but actually is quite important. So in particular, challenge, the model shows that too much challenge leads to anxiety, too little leads to boredom. So, appropriate levels of challenge, proximity, we realized that, it answers the question, why put media outdoors? Obviously, it's less effort to listen to something and watch a video than watch and read. So you're already lowering that sort of level of challenge. It reduces the effort required to actually seek out information. People don't necessarily visit websites or go online to try and find these things. It's right there. And it also makes content relevant, which kind of lowers those cognitive connections. And adding sound can be brilliant because, for example, you can add bird song and things like that, and videos that help with identification in a relevant place. So accessibility, video and animation supports understanding for everybody, but particularly people with neurodiversity, dyslexia, sight impairment, and so on. Different senses as well, lowers cognitive effort for everybody. And this is kind of an example of a video. I'm actually not going to play it, but it's basically an example of how we create animations that are kind of quite enticing and compelling and sort of get information across to people. So concentration, another part of the model, it explains why video and animation are better than actually kind of reading a board. It's kind of common sense in a way, but our perception mechanisms are alerted to movement. This is since we were cave people, looking out for threats or what we were going to hunt. It's just part of our perception mechanisms that movement is more alerting. So it's just much easier to concentrate on it. Obviously, we have the TikTok generation now, Reels, but a lot of people spend time on, looking at videos. It kind of bridges the gap for young people and just makes the information more entertaining. Also, more importantly, you get a lot more information across in a very short time. So this is a project that sort of exemplifies that. This was a project for Net Foundation, Ada River Recovery, talking about how rewilding close to rivers really can sort of affect, sort of really improve natural environments, and also sort of focusing on the creatures that are going to benefit from it. In a 2-minute video, you can get an awful lot across about that. So the other one is control, and this is about our emotional needs, and it just vary compared from person to person, but it's about how we maintain interest, and we look at different sort of mechanisms for that. Some people like a lot of autonomy. They like to have choices, they like to explore, they like to have the chance to do their own thing. Other people are motivated by competence, so gamification, rewards, showing their abilities and quizzes. And what we've tried to do is combine both of those elements to appeal to both kinds of people. within the content of the trails and exhibits. So this is the thing I've added. So related to the flow model, so relatedness, and this is kind of like why you'd be interested to start with. What is the appeal of something? Does it relate to me? And I don't know if you've seen Project Wild Thing, which is all about marketing nature. The whole film is suggesting that nature has a bit of a marketing problem, has a bit of a branding problem. So it's kind of like looking at what are those levers to sort of encourage people to engage with exhibits right from the start. So a good example, going back to the beach question, is, you know, referring to human needs. So encouraging exercise, mental health. Our aim, one of our kind of upcoming projects, is to create a Shinrin Yoku, which is kind of the Japanese word for forest bathing, just to kind of encourage people to be in nature. But also the trails themselves create community engagement. We do, like I said, design them with communities, but it also creates a focal point for involvement, increasing social capital. So one of our trails is kind of for a forest school, and they use it quite regularly with wider audiences, with the children as well, but with wider audience to engage people in what they're doing and the importance of it. And, you know, sneaking in, that kind of, not sneaking in, some people are very interested, but you can also relate that to bigger picture stuff, relationship to climate, nature decline, and so on, in a very positive way. So this is a good example of one of our community-based projects. We're working with Sussex Bay, who are working with along on the Sussex coast, 100 miles of the coast. But this is all about worthing, and it's all about sustainable fishing. So people can view these interactive boards. We've got interviews with fishermen. We've got historical facts as well. We've got recipes. We've got the video that I was going to show you is that kind of like why people might buy sustainable fish and why that might help fish stocks to recover and support wildlife as well. So kind of a historical component to that, people component, but also kind of about nature. So yeah, I mean, the other one we can do is, you know, creating that empathy with nature and the kind of content that would appeal to people to create that empathy, really, and characters and storytelling is quite important. Telling the stories behind creatures, their habitat, and you know, and their issues as well. The other things, I call this the cat video principle, and I apologize, but it kind of using cute creatures, again, sounds a little bit trite, but the number of hits on Instagram reels is phenomenal that have kind of wildlife and you know, tell those stories. Sort of using that, but also kind of introducing other creatures alongside them, so using that as an enticement. And the other thing is just kind of raising awareness. So through that identification, you know, if I know the name of something exists, I'm sure you're all aware that words like acorn and bluebell, and I can't remember the others, have been sort of removed from the Junior Oxford Dictionary and been replaced by technological ones. So just kind of, not just for children, but for everybody, just naming things, but in an entertaining way. So yeah, that was an example of an interactive trail talking about rivers again, and just kind of ways of sort of telling the story of the water bowl. You know, hugely limited numbers of it. I'm not sure how I'm doing for time. Maybe okay. So yeah, so in summary, what we're aiming to do with these things is to lower barriers to engagement with natural spaces by making things more accessible and more inclusive and more entertaining, increasing connection and raising awareness on location to make information relevant, to make everything more compelling, and to attract visitors, and you know, ask them to respect the land. But also the thing that I've kind of missed out is creating income for organisations. So if it's you know, that sometimes they can be considered a bit of a tourist attraction. We can also include fundraising, because we're sort of using web AR. We can create sort of, you know, include campaign videos and that kind of thing. future projects, we're going to make things more physical as well. We want to kind of, I don't have a slide about this, but we've been working with local sculptors and people who create sort of physical interactive trails to create sort of new products that also have that kind of physical engagement with them as well, but using the AR to sort of support that inclusivity. So yeah, just the David Attenborough quote, which you probably all heard, and no one will protect what they don't first care about, and no one will care about what they've never experienced. So yeah, this is kind of what we're all about, really. Okay, thank you for...
Well, thank you, Catherine, and great quote to end on. So, and a couple of questions coming in through the text, the chats there. I think Elizabeth had a reflection on Logan's meadow, where they have a particular problem with dog walkers, but also a question from, I don't know your particular name, Bukabab, about is there any evidence that generational normalization is impacting younger people's perception of nature and climate change?
I think that younger people are actually super concerned about climate change. But the evidence would be that there's also a complete disconnect with nature. I don't think they're necessarily making those connections. I mean, there is, you know, the new GCSE in nature might support that change. I don't know what the curriculum is at the moment. That's kind of next on the agenda. But I think that I think that perceptions will change. I'm not sure that certainly, there's a lot of social and cultural barriers anyway to engaging with real natural spaces. And I think the point is, unless children are in those spaces, they're not going to appreciate the value of them. It's okay teaching them in a classroom about, different creatures, but actually being there is the important thing, and understanding that sort of feeling and the benefits of it. I don't know if that's answered the question.
I think so, yeah. Thank you very much indeed, Catherine. I mean, Quinton points to a very practical difficulty is where in Cambridgeshire we tried QR codes on information boards at some of the heritage sites, but the network coverage was insufficient. So all of the thinking about the interactivity does depend sometimes on the network and the connections. Which
yeah, I mean, with the web AR, you can sort of download beforehand if you use an app. So there is an app where you can download it beforehand, and then really all you need is data to actually action it. The other thing we're working on is more of a near field communication solution to get around that problem. We haven't found a site yet that couldn't work with either data or internet.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Well, that's things are just improving from when the last time when Quinton tried it in Cambridge. So perhaps we need to go back to this. Is Nicola still with us? I'm just looking. No. Well, thanks, Catherine. That was really interesting, and thank you so much for keeping to time. It's really to see that the thinking behind something that you just noticed on the board, and to see how methodically they're developed is really eye-opening. So thank you very much indeed. We're on to the next speaker, Daniel. If you're out there, you're up next, Daniel.
Yeah, sure. Sorry if you can't see me. I blame Windows 11. My videos stopped working for some reason, but hopefully you can hear me okay.
Yeah, we got a good picture of the Ouse Washes, so we're in business, I think. And
that's even better. Okay, I will start off. So, yes, I'm Daniel Pullan. I'm the Senior Conservation Officer working for the RSPB in Cambridgeshire, Bedfordshire and Hertfordshire. So we principally work within the Cambridgeshire Fens, because that's where most of the nature is within our area. I'll be talking to you about these washes today. If I can get the slide to go on. Here we are. So just to give you a bit of a idea of the geography of where the Ouse Washes is and where the RSPB works within Cambridgeshire. So the pink outline you can see on this map is what we call our priority landscape. So this is where the RSPB is principally working within Cambridgeshire, and also a bit in the sort of Norfolk and Suffolk Fens as well, and towards the north and east of that map. You can see the sort of principal designated sites within the Cambridgeshire Fens on this map. So the big longitudinal site coming out of Peterborough, which is Ouse Washes. And then you've got the big long site striding across the Cambridgeshire Fens in the middle of the map there, which is the Ouse Washes, which I'll be talking to you about today. We've got a number of other RSPB reserves within this landscape as well, though. So we've got the Ouse Fen, Fen Drayton Lakes, to the sort of south of the Ouse Washes there in the Great Ouse Valley, which are sort of ex-mineral sites, which are now wetland sites. And over on the east of that map, you've got Lake and Heath Fen, which is a newish wetland site that we've got in the Suffolk and Norfolk Fens over there. You've also got the other principal sites within the Cambridgeshire Fens on this map. So to the west, you can see Holm Fen and Woodwalton Fen, which obviously are part of the Great Fen project with the Wildlife Trust. And then in the southeast, you've got Wicken Fen with various satellite sites there with the National Trust Wicken Vision as well. Zooming in a bit to the Ouse Washes itself, the red area that you can see on this map is the area that the RSPB owns and manages, and the sort of southern 2/3 of these washes. The Wildlife Trust does own some of that land as well, but we manage it for them. And then not actually indicated on this map, but in just the north of our reserve there, going up towards Downham Market, is the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust Welney Reserve in the northern third of the marshes. And I'm sure many of you will be very familiar with their reserve and their lovely visitor centre and cafe they've got there. So if I just move back just to the first slide here, just to give you an idea of what the Ouse Washes is. So Ouse Washes is basically a flood reservoir. So it was built by Vermuyden, the very famous Dutch engineer back in the 17th century when he was in the business of draining the fens. It's basically got two big long flood banks that go on either side with rivers outside of that. But basically the purpose of these washes is to take the flood waters of the Great Ouse catchment in the winter. So the Great Ouse catchment is a very large river system in East England, rises sort of Bracknell Way in Buckinghamshire, goes through Milton Keynes, Bedford, St Neots, St Ives, and then now once it gets to Erith, once the river levels get above a certain level, the gates there are triggered and the water flows onto these washes, and it basically stops the south and middle levels from going underwater every year. And it's been doing that very effectively for the last 300 years and will probably carry on doing so as well. So it's a flood reservoir, but it's also exceedingly important for its nature conservation interests. So it's still, a fairly extensively managed bit of land. It hasn't been converted into, intensive arable at any point in the past. And from our perspective, it's really very, very important for a number of things. So in the summer, it's internationally important for its breeding waders. So these are the sort of birds that you would typically see on mud flats on the coastlands in the winter, but they breed on wet grassland habitat, which we've got lots of on these washes. The bird you can see on the top left of that page is black-tailed godwit. So Ouse Washes and Lean Washes together have about 85% of all of the black-tailed godwits breeding in this country. So super, super important for that species. Below there, we've got redshank, snipe, and lapwing. So we've got a very, very important assemblage of other breeding waders on the washes as well in the summer, and it's designated as a special protection area for those birds. And then in the winter, we host thousands of wintering wildfowl. So that's things like widgeon, but also principally things like wintering Buick swans and hooper swans. This is a map which I nicked off the BTO, but just gives you an idea of the migration that these swans go through to winter with us every winter. You'll be very familiar, I'm sure, with seeing them on the farmland of the fens, feeding on sort of crop residues and that sort of thing. So on the left-hand side there, we've got the migration of hooper swans. So we host the breeding population that breeds in Iceland. They come down every winter to be with us. And then on the right-hand side, we've got the migration pathway of Buick swans. So they breed in the sort of high Arctic up in Russia, and then travel down in the winter through Northern Europe to winter with us in the UK, but also in lots of the Netherlands, and in the sort of Southern Baltic. Hoop swan populations have been increasing over the last few decades and doing very well. Buick swan populations in the UK have decreased over the last few decades. I think our scientists think that's not necessarily an issue with their populations, but more to do with something called short stopping. So that's basically that we're having milder winters, principally with things like climate change, and therefore they don't have to travel as far to find food resources they need to survive in the winter. So lots more of them are staying in places like Germany and Netherlands and not actually reaching the UK. So, but we still get, internationally important numbers of Buicks every year, wintering in the fens and roosting on the Ouse Washes and the Neem Washes. So that's some of the principal bird interests of the Ouse Washes. In terms of how we manage the site, we manage it principally through cattle grazing. So in the spring through to the early autumn, we bring on over 1,000 head of cattle onto the site using local graziers. And then our reserve staff spend an awful lot of the time in the summer herding cattle and making sure that they're okay. And they do a really important job of grazing down all this lovely, lush grass that we've got on those washes, getting it down to a really short sward height, which is then perfect for breeding waders the next spring, because they like short grass. They're ground nesting birds, like short grass with big, long sight lines, so they can see predators coming down the tracks. Ouse Washes, as well as being a really important, flood management resource, really important for nature conservation. It's also a really important agricultural asset within the Cambridgeshire landscape as well. So the Ouse Washes and the Neem Washes are sort of the principal grazing habitat for cattle within this area. And lots of graziers rely on this land to graze their cattle. But the Ouse Washes is in trouble, and it has been for quite a while now. One of the principal causes of that trouble is something called spring and summer flooding. So, this is a flood reservoir. It's supposed to flood up in the winter, which it does, and then drain down in the spring, and then is used by the breeding waders to breed on. Since the sort of late 1970s, though, we've had an increasing frequency and severity of flooding later in the year. So this is when we get a large rainfall event in the upper catchment because of land use change in the upper catchment. The water's coming off the land much faster, shooting down the Great Ouse, triggers the Erith gates, and then floods these washes in the spring and early summer. Even a couple of inches of water on the land will then drown out all of these wader nests, and then that basically stops the breeding productivity of the waders that year. If that happens too often, then what's happened basically is that breeding populations of waders have decreased quite dramatically over the last few decades because of these spring and summer floods. There's limited things that we can do on the site to stop that from happening. And to be honest, with climate change, this is only really going one way. We're going to continue to get worse and worse spring and summer flooding, probably. Things that might mitigate that a little bit, things like potentially the Fens Reservoir, taking some water off at the right times of year, but it's only going one way. So we've been looking with our partners at what we can do to address that. And one of the principal ways we can address that is by creating new wetland habitat outside of the flood banks. So new wet grassland adjacent to the site, but outside of the flood banks. The first site that we did that on was a site called the Pilot Project near to our Pearls Bridge Visitor Centre. And we rented some land off the Cambridgeshire county farms and converted it into wet grassland. It was chock full of waders and has been ever since. It's got one of the highest concentrations of breeding waders in the country now. And it was sort of proof of concept that we could create this habitat outside of the site. When the site is flooded in the spring, the adult birds nest on this lifeboat site effectively, and then they take their chicks over the flood bank to feed on these washes later in the year. This has now been replicated in a number of other sites. So Lady Fen next to Welney, next to WWT, Welney Reserve, Coveney, where the Environment Agency have created a new set of wet grassland on the other side of the washes. And again, we managed that site for the Environment Agency, and that's been very, very successful now. And they're also in the process of creating a new site near Sutton, which will hopefully get a lot more wet grassland on site as well. So those sites have been very, very successful. We've managed to get sort of populations of breeding redshank and lapwing up to their sort of historical levels now, which is great success. Snipe and black-tailed godwit, we've still got a ways to go though. So we need a lot more wet grassland, safe wet grassland habitat within this surrounding landscape if we're going to recover those populations longer term, make them sort of sustainable in the face of climate change as well. Another issue, as well as the flooding, though, is predation of waded chicks. This is an issue at Neem Washes, but it's also an issue at the Ouse Washes, particularly in the new habitat creation schemes. So we've been very busy with our partners putting up predator fences to try and keep out mammalian predators. Aerial is sort of, avian predators are an issue as well, so things like marsh hares and corvids, but we can't really do very much about that. But we can try and keep foxes and badgers out of these sites, and that's how we use predator fences to do that, dug into the ground so they can't bury underneath them. However, it has been a bit of an arms race with the badgers in particular. So we put trail cameras up to see what's happening with these fences. You can see some photographs here of a badger climbing over a predator fence, which we didn't think they could do. So we had to put up some overhangs to stop them from doing that. There's a video of a badger pushing itself through the mesh of a predator fence. So we had to reduce the mesh size of the predator fences to make sure that they can't do that. We've got clever badgers. So this is the badger putting his claw in and going through a one-way gate. And then finally, the pièce de résistance. This is a diving badger, which we never thought they could do. But this is the badger who's worked out there's a hole in the bottom of the fence underneath the drainage ditch, and it's dived underneath. So we've got a constant thing to make sure we're plugging gaps. We're amending the design of these fences to try and keep the badgers out. But hopefully we're getting there, and hopefully what we call the productivity of the waders, because we're reducing this predation pressure, is increasing on these sites over time, so that we're continuing to increase the numbers of breeding waders into the future. Just to talk about a couple of the projects that we've got ongoing in and around the Ouse Washes. I mentioned black-tailed godwits before and how important they are within the Ouse Washes and the Neem Washes. So we hold most of the breeding population within the country here. Again, due to these flooding problems at the Ouse Washes and due to predation pressures, like the other waders on the site, black-tailed godwit populations have been decreasing over the last few decades. So we went together with WWT and went to get some funding from the EU a number of years ago now to set up a project called Project Godwit. That had a number of actions to try and bolster the populations of breeding black-tailed godwits at the Ouse and Neem Washes. But one of the principal actions was something called head starting. So this is basically taking eggs from nests on the Neem Washes, incubating them at Welney, at WWT Reserve, hatching them out, keeping them in aviaries until they fledge, and then releasing the fledged birds back onto the Neem Washes, where they migrate off with the adult birds and come back the next year and breed, hopefully. This has been really, really successful. We've had over 200, I think, fledged birds migrating off and some of those adults coming back again. We've managed to bolster the populations at the Ouse and Neem Washes over the time of the project. The project's finished now, but WWT are carrying on this head starting work for the foreseeable. So we carry on bolstering these populations going forwards. So really successful project, but the black-tailed godwits aren't out of the woods. We're probably going to need to continue this head starting work into the future for the moment. And long term, what we need is more wet grassland habitat in and around the Ouse Washes, so that we can protect them from the flooding issue, but also so that we can reduce the predation pressures going forwards. Because at the moment, we've got the Neem and the Ouse Washes, which are these honeypot sites where all the breeding waders are, attracting all of the predators to have their black-tailed godwit chick lunch. And what we need is much more habitat, so that they're more widespread within the landscape, and get back to a situation where we probably were 100 years ago, where these waders were much more widespread across the landscape. A related project is to do with corncrakes and corncrake reintroduction. So corncrakes is a species that used to be very widespread across the UK in farmland. It's a species breeding in meadowlands, basically in long grass. But in the past century, their populations decreased, mostly to do with loss of meadowlands, and that's related to the intensification of agriculture and the loss of horses in the landscape and the conversion to tractors, therefore having a lot less need for hay within the landscape, but also the intensification of hay meadows as well. So if you think about a silage field now, it's harvested much earlier in the season, which is basically before the corncrakes get a chance to get their chicks off the field. So within the last century, corncrakes were basically wiped out within England and Wales. They were hanging on by their beaks in the Outer Hebrides, where the sort of crofting system there, which is much more extensively managed land, allowed them to thrive still. A number of years ago, we got together with WWT again, but also with the Zoological Society of London and the Pensort Trust in London, in Norfolk, to try and see whether we could reintroduce corncrakes back into England. We decided that the Nene and Ouse Washes was a really good couple of sites to do that because of all this grassland habitat we've got there. So we did a similar sort of process. We took eggs initially from Poland, but then from the Outer Hebrides as well, incubated them, protected the chicks at Welney now, and then released them onto what was the Nene Washes, and now we do it on the Ouse Washes. This is a project which is ongoing, principally led by WWT now. We've got breeding populations of adults coming back to the Ouse Washes every year now, which is great, and they are gradually increasing. I don't think we're probably at a sustainable population yet, but if we carry on this work and if we start to get more extensively managed grassland in the wider landscape, then hopefully we'll get to a stage where we've got a sustainable population of corncrake, which can then expand out into the fens and into the Norfolk countryside in the next few years as well. And there's the call of the corncrakes, the cracks. Would have been very common in the fens back 100 years ago, and hopefully will be in the future. So the last thing I want to talk to you about before I end is just a very exciting project that we've got ongoing. So this landscape recovery project is basically the highest level of the new ELMS government subsidy scheme for farmers to do sort of environmental works on their farmed land. And this highest tier of projects basically encourages farmers to come forward with projects to do habitat creation at a sort of landscape scale. So a couple of years ago, we got together with 9 other landowners around the Ouse Washes and up into the Wissey Valley in Norfolk. And these are a set of landowners who are very, very keen to do something different on their land, really good for nature, and they want to create lots of wetland habitat on their land. So we bid to DEFRA, got that bid accepted. We're now in a process of doing a sort of development project for that project over the next, we're halfway through a 2-year development project. And within that development project, we're working out what habitat creation we might be able to do, whether that's feasible, what consents we need, what other alternative finance we can bring into those habitat creation projects, so things like biodiversity net gain, carbon finance, etc. And then next year, we'll go back to DEFRA, tell them what we want to do, and then hopefully negotiate a subsidy level with them where they will then pay for our farmers over the next 20 years to go ahead and do that habitat creation work. So very, very exciting project. If it goes ahead, this should bring loads more wet grassland and wetland habitats into the landscape around the Ouse Washes and up into the Wissey. So hopefully a really exciting project and totally in line with our need to get more of this habitat for our breeding waders into the future and to make them resilient to climate change in the next few decades. So that's it. Thank you for listening. If you've got any questions, very happy to answer them if I can.
Daniel, thank you. That was really interesting and great to hear what's going on and what the RSPB are doing in the area. There are some questions in the chat, particularly relating to water, and I've no doubt that Lindsay will pick up on some of these themes in his presentation in a few moments. But the specific first question was, what is there any early indications of what the impact of the new reservoir Chatteris might be on the washes?
So I think there's lots of opportunity in terms of wetland creation with the reservoir. So they're talking about some very significant wetland creation around the outside of the reservoir there, which is very exciting. Potentially there could be some very significant benefits for the Ouse Washes. I mentioned that potentially they might be able to take water off the Ouse Washes when they're filling the reservoir in the winter. If that can be reactive in the spring as well, then there might be some potential to reduce the spring flooding issue once it comes online in a decade's time. So we're pushing very hard for that. We're hoping that might be possible. It will be a sticking plaster. So with climate change, we're never going to get rid of the spring flooding problem, but it could make the situation a lot better than it would have been if it does go ahead.
Thank you. There's a further conversation already going on, which Roger is helpfully contributing as well, Sue, is about the availability of water to reverse a drastic decline of the area's wildlife. The consensus in the conversation is about management of the water that's available. But the point having been made that 90% of the UK's wetlands has been destroyed in the last 100 years, shouldn't we be re-wetting and restoration of the fens be prioritised? Which I understand, I'm definitely no expert in this area, is more complicated than it might sound, but I don't know if you have anything to add in turn, Daniel, about the availability of water. It's more about availability at the right time of the year, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's right. So a lot of our sites at the moment are winter fed. So we're like farmers' reservoirs. We're taking water from the rivers and the catchments in the winter when we've got loads of it and too much of it, and then using that in the spring and summer. Some of our sites like Coveney, we have a reservoir, a bit like farmers do, which we fill up in the winter, and then that keeps the site nice and wet during the spring and summer. But it's a similar issue to farmers. Basically, yes, we've got too much of it in the winter, and sometimes not enough of it in the summer, and so we need to be able to manage our water so that we're not pumping it all out to sea in the winter, and that we are actually retaining some of it on the landscape. And in terms of our ambitions for wetland habitat creation, obviously we want more of it to support these species that I've been talking about, but we also recognise that the Fens is super important as a food production centre in the UK, and we think we can have both. We can have more nature and more wetland habitat, but also more sustainable farming as well. So that's what we're trying to achieve.
Thank you, and I should at this point put an advert in for some of the work that Natural Cambridgeshire has been involved in about building up a system of farm level reservoirs which help to manage that water flow in the future. I think that's a good lead in as well. I think if we may at this point is move on to Lindsay Hargreaves. Lindsay, if you're ready to present, and with a provocative question: is there plenty of water in Cambridgeshire? ?
Thank you very much, Martin. Can we do a very quick sound check? Am I coming through okay?
Yeah, you're loud and clear.
That's great. Thank you very much. Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for inviting me along. Firstly, just by way of introduction, I'm Lindsay Hargreaves. I'm a farmer by background. Through my farming career, which I stepped back from a few years ago, I was constantly involved in farming, which relied heavily on water for the irrigation of vegetable crops. So that triggered an interest in the regulation of water for agriculture and how it works. More recently, I became a non-executive director of Water Resources East, which is one of the 5 regional organisations or groups set up by government to create long-term multi-sector water resources plans for the eastern, in our case, Water Resources for the eastern region, which covers an area from the River Humber, the Humber Bank in the north to the Thames in the south, and central England through to the east coast. In other water-related activities, I chair the Riverlark Abstractors Group, which is a chalk stream. It is over in Suffolk, not in Cambridgeshire, but you have chalk streams in Cambridgeshire too. And I'm a board member of the Lake and Heath Internal Drainage Board, which is part of the South Level Drainage District, most of which is in Cambridge. So that gives me an insight into how level controlled water systems work. I contribute to the National Framework for Water Resources through my work with the National Farmers Union and other organisations, and I support collaborative activity in a multi-sector sense across a number of initiatives in the region, including the Water for Cambridge project that Marta just mentioned, but I might refer to that later, and one or two other activities. I'm also involved with the Camley-Lees Catchment Partnership and the River Lark Catchment Partnership. I ought to emphasise that all thoughts and comments are my own. I hope that they reflect the organisations I work with, but I'm not speaking here in any way representing them. But so how to approach this question? I mean, it ought to be, is there plenty of water in Cambridgeshire? It ought to be a fairly simple yes or no. Either there is or there isn't. But as with so many things in life, it's never that straightforward. And in fact, I spoke to somebody yesterday and I just dropped the question on them. And the answer was, well, it depends where you are. And I think that was quite reassuring for me, because that was where I was leading to. And it was sort of one of those questions where you could almost say to somebody, well, what answer would you like me to give you? And I will construct a case to deliver it. And perceptions are influenced by all sorts of things. So if you look at, if you think in terms of Cambridgeshire, and if you live and work in Cambridgeshire, and you're asked this question, well, how you view it might depend upon where we are on the calendar, or on the season, whether it's winter or summer. In a prevailing weather pattern, you ask somebody only a few months ago, after a long period of sustained wet weather, their answer might be different from the answer you would get now, when we haven't had rain for 3 months, or any significant rain for 3 months, and your garden's turning to a desert. You might be influenced by the principal purpose that where you interact with what your interests are. So if you're particularly conscious of environmental matters, you might think that water stress in Cambridgeshire is, well, in parts of Cambridge is quite high if you're in the Highlands, but if you're in the Ouse Washes in the middle of winter, you might think differently. And if your main interface is through public water supply, well, as a user of public water supply, if you turn the tap and water comes out, well, that's okay, everything works. If you're in managing the resources, you're working for a public water company, you might again see that one differently. And the same goes for agriculture, where at the moment, even farmers in Cambridgeshire who do not rely on irrigation for their production, but rely on rain-fed agriculture, they might be feeling a bit nervous at the moment, and thinking that there is actually not plenty of water in Cambridgeshire just now. It would be a different matter not many months ago, when they were struggling to get on the land. And if you're a planning officer, or you're engaged in development of the built environment, and if you're asked the question, if you're planning to develop a site or build a new hospital or a data centre, if you ask them, is there plenty of water in Cambridgeshire, I think the answer would be pretty stark. There is a matter of place as well, and we've touched on some of that. Whereabouts are you? Some places seem a bit wetter and others a bit drier. And we mustn't forget also where quality of water fits into this. It's very, very easy to describe water as a single generic, but of course, is the water of a suitable quality for the purpose that you're thinking of using it for? And then another aspect to it, perhaps a final aspect in this part of what I'm wishing to say, is that when we say plenty of water in Cambridgeshire, what do we think about the source of water? Are we thinking about the water that, if you like, landed on Cambridgeshire as rain, and that's undoubtedly and intrinsically Cambridgeshire's water? Or are we thinking about water that happens to arrive in Cambridgeshire from some other primary source? So we've got, as we've seen from earlier presentations, there's a fairly significant river systems that flow through Cambridgeshire. So is the water in those rivers? Well, it's in Cambridgeshire, so possession is 9 points of the law. It's ours to do with, that is the water of Cambridgeshire. And there's also, of course, water that's imported by man-made structures. There is, as some of you will know, an aqueduct from sourcing its water in the in the chalk aquifer to the east of Thetford in Norfolk, which is transported into public water supply in Cambridge. Now that aquifer exists. I don't know whether it works every day or what its operation activity is. That doesn't matter. The fact is that it's there. So we can probably conclude actually that there's a popular view amongst most people that we are a bit short of water. So the question is there plenty of water? Well, no, we're a bit short. Rivers and aquifers do struggle a lot of the time. Public water supply is under stress. Farmers are restricted and developers are constrained. And those sentiments are supported by many studies and reports, including the Water Resources East 25-year plan. But it poses the question for me, are we short of water or are we short of water resources management? And I could make or I will make the assertion, if you like, or the suggestion that our resource management planning has not kept up with our wider demands on for water on the wider environment. And I don't want to get into to point fingers or get into a blame game. That doesn't help. I think we're all in this. We've all got our roles to all played a part in where we are. And the thing is okay, what do we do about it? And I define plenty as meaning enough water to cover all of our needs with a bit left over, whatever those needs are. And that definition can be satisfied at the moment. In the present tense, we can say that that in some places, some of the time, there is plenty of water. But how do we move to a position where it is a case that all places, all of the time, and that, if you like, is the challenge. And I thought it was worth and appropriate just to make a few comments about, well, okay, if we think that things are a bit stressed, and if we accept that it's water management that's lacking and planning that's lacking rather than water itself, then what sorts of things are we doing to move from A to B? And I guess it's always useful in these things, I think, to start from an environmental background, because a healthy environment in every sense, including a water environment, is the starting point for everything else we do. If we don't get that right, then the rest doesn't matter. And there's a lot of work in so-called environmental destination planning. So this is the activity that takes us beyond where we are with restoring sustainable abstraction and avoiding further deterioration through the Water Framework Directive and going beyond that. So environmental destination planning, a remediation process that will reduce, which will put back the environment to where it needs to be. But one of the consequences of that will be it will reduce the access to water for all the other needs for water as we know it today. So it's great. I think we can be optimistic and say that if all of those initiatives, which are backed by regulation, that will restore our water environment, but what about everything else that we need water for, so that we can satisfy this statement that there is plenty of water in Cambridgeshire. So in no particular order, but given that public water supply is the dominant water system outside of the environment, then what is happening there? Well, public water companies have their 25-year water resource management plans, and we can take some comfort that in the longer term things will be sorted out. We've got the Grafham Water Transfer project, which by 2027 or 2032, whichever timescale you want to work on, will bring another 15 megalitres a day into the county for 15 years. We've got the Fens Reservoir project, which has been mentioned, which from 2037 or thereabouts, subject to delays, will bring in 44 megalitres a day and will take over from the Grafham reservoir transfer. And then we've got the Milton or the proposed wastewater treatment works near Milton from 2041, which will bring another significant quantity of water back into the system that isn't there before. In the nearer term, we've got commitments from water companies to reduce leakage, to introduce more metering of water and smart metering, and to influence consumer behaviour, and also the so-called water credit system and this is the system whereby existing water users are incentivized to reduce their water use, and that reduction can then be used to allow further development to take place. Within agriculture, we have the Environment Agency funded local resource option screening studies, and that's a process that began last year. There was a round of studies, about 20 of them across England, where groups of farmers were encouraged, or farmers were encouraged to form small groups to look at with professional support to look at how their access to water worked and how it could be optimized. And those studies were two of which were in Cambridgeshire, were very successful in terms of leading towards a more optimal use of access to water, better ways of storing water, better ways of managing our access to water in a sustainable and ongoing way. And it's encouraging for those of us in farming to know that the Environment Agency is funding another round of those studies in the coming year, and seeing this development of collaborative thinking and working within agriculture is quite encouraging. What's even more encouraging, which has also been referred to and I think spoken of in this forum before, is cross-sector working, and the so-called Water for Cambridge group, which is fronted by Matthew Bullock, who's on the call today, looking at how farm-scale and farmer-driven reservoirs can be used to support public water supply in Cambridge, and that idea is gaining traction. It's still very much an idea, but it's encouraging to know that it's being supported by both the Environment Agency and the Ministry for Housing as part of a response to say, well, how can we? Are there some near-term things we can do to take some of this pressure off water supply? And looking at things from a slightly different angle, there is some very interesting work being done by Water Resources East in the Upper Cam. It's called the Upper Cam monitoring trials, and it's looking at recharge attenuation features, and that's being backed by funded by DEFRA, the Ministry of Housing, the Environment Agency, and Affinity Water. And what that is doing is looking at the kinds of features that we can, physical features on the ground that we can put into the drainage system, the surface water drainage system, to hold water back in the environment and to encourage that water to not only slow its path into the main water courses, in this case the River Cam, but also to encourage that water into the substrata, into the groundwater. Now, that concept, of course, there's nothing novel in that concept. A lot of people do it. The novelty in this particular work is the way it's going to be monitored and supervised, and such a way that we can validate the Environment Agencies and Water Resources groundwater recharge models, and see whether and try and quantify, put some objectivity into how this concept can change water availability, base flow support in the rivers, and groundwater recharge. There is this group, well, I'm sure will be familiar with Fenland Soil, which is a farmer-led, not-for-profit organisation looking to tackle climate change issues relating to agriculture and peatlands in the low-lying areas of Cambridge. So there's I've used those few examples just to illustrate the sorts of things that we're doing. I suppose by way of conclusion, I might say that that there is plenty of water in Cambridgeshire, but we lack effective water management. And I, for one, am optimistic that we are capable of catching up. Some events that will influence that in the coming weeks and months. We have the launch of the second iteration of the National Framework for Water Resources. That happens in a week's time. And we've had a preliminary report from Sir John Cunliffe's review of governance in the water sector that arrived last week, where there's a lot of, and those two together, I think, should give us further reason for optimism in their support for and promotion, or anticipated, sorry, I don't really know yet, promotion of working through these problems at a much more local and catchment-based level, and also in a much broader and more effective and comprehensive cross-sector way. So yeah, so thank you for giving me the opportunity. Answer the question is a qualified yes. There is plenty of water in Cambridgeshire.
Thank you very much indeed, Lindsay. So all about management, obviously, in that regard. There's a couple of debates going on in the chat. One, I think we're perhaps with Peter's agreement or investigation we might come to later, is about the long-term consequences of sea level rise, and in terms of thinking that through. It's not a question for you today. I don't think it's one for the future. The other one that is here, though, is how in all the multiple demands for water, does nature get any prioritization over the needs of house building and or farming? Is it always going to be the last in the queue, or is there some ways in which we can manage it as an overall resource to address the needs of nature?
I find this such an interesting one, isn't it? And it's a matter of perception, and it's also a matter of the interface between regulation and reality. So the various, water bills and environment acts and so on that there have been in recent times really say that the environment comes first and first, or first, second, and third. But I can understand the frustration of a lot of people with an environmental focus when you say, well, okay, well, that's all very well saying that, but why? In which case, why are so many aspects of our natural environment in such need of remediation? I don't feel entirely qualified to answer that. I mean, there are certain things that come to mind, but I think there are some realities in this that we're not really facing up to yet. We will do in due course, and I'm sure there are answers. But the thing is, when push comes to shove, with however many million people there are on this island, if the taps run dry, there will be trouble. So of course, public water supply, when you take it down to the wire, public water supply is always going to win. What we need to work on is processes and methodologies that don't push us into that extreme position. Now, maybe that's idealism, maybe that's something that we can never achieve, but it's something that we can work towards. And I think that's where the reports like the Cunliffe Review and the second iteration of the National Framework for Water Resources are pushing us further in that direction of being in the this whole matter of cross-sector collaboration and saying, well, we're all in this together. We all have an interest in achieving all of these things. There will have to be compromises and trade-offs. But I do think we come from a place not that long ago where that balance was very much in favor of other priorities, and that priority thing is shifting. But as with so many things which are heavily influenced by regulation, the wheels, the machinery of regulation, those wheels turn only slowly. So don't expect a revolution, but I think we are evolving in the right direction. Have we got time?
So thank you for that hopeful note. Just reflecting the question about Bob Ench's observation that most chalk streams in Cambridgeshire are dry in the summer. Well, again, that's the management, and you did address some of the issues about the chalk streams, I think, in your comments.
Indeed, and it is so important that we do that, and this is one of the failings of the process in the past. Why did we not see the growth of Cambridge being as rapid as it was? Why did we not see that some of these plans, could be deficient? Why did we allow government to put so much downward pressure on water prices? The price we pay for water, and ultimately it's our water bills that pay for all the environmental remediation that we're going to do to get things back to where they are. And water companies were under huge pressure to keep their prices down. They weren't allowed to put the environmental plans in through WINEP, the Water Industry Natural Environment Plan. They weren't allowed to build extra infrastructure to allow for the growth of Cambridge that actually happened. So it's not. There's a lot of people take a share of the responsibility for the fact that we're in this pickle. What we need to do now is focus collectively on how we get out of it.
Yeah, I think there's a whole other debate about the water industry and the behaviour of the water companies, but I think that's for another day. But nonetheless, always interesting to have a view. Roger, you wanted to ask a question.
To jump in. Sorry, I don't know if you can see me.
It's not so much a question.
I'm actually Bacoba. I don't know if you can see me.
Yeah.
I just wanted to quickly respond to what Lindsay's just been saying. I actually sat on WRE steering groups, and I've just recently retired from the Environment Agency. And I would really appreciate an answer to the fact, well, let's not say a fact, the very real probability that the Fens is going to be completely flooded within 100 to 150 years. So building a new reservoir is a complete waste of time. That's not me saying that. That's Dr. Robert Larter from the British Antarctica Survey. So could we have a response to that, please?
Yeah, you can look at things in all sorts of different timescales, and I would agree that that we need a much better plan to to protect the Fens, to decide what we want from the Fens. That's the first decision. Do we want the Fens or not? Now, let's just assume for the moment that we do want the Fens. And so something has to start happening, and it has to start happening pretty soon, because we're already seeing the impacts of inward investment. And there might be some on this call who are familiar with the FFIA initiative, Future Fens into something adaptation. And that's the one that says that we're not going to get economic development if people who want to start their businesses here feel they're going to suspect they're going to be under 3 feet of water in 50 years' time. But the thing about the Fens is, although the big reservoirs, they are going to help us sort out problems in the next sort of 25 to 50 years. The coastal problem really kicks in 50 to 75 years. So yes, we've got to keep working on these things in parallel. But to say we do nothing about the Fens Reservoir or about our water supply until we have got a concrete answer on the protection on sea level rise, I can see the beauty and simplicity of that, but I think the political reality is rather different. And the government has made, or the successive governments of the day have made various commitments and comments about that. There is a bit more money going into flood defence, but frankly, I don't believe that we've got a reasonable and rational answer yet. I mean, to simply build the wall higher all the way around the wash as it exists today is, that seems like the obvious answer, but it doesn't seem, there are various complications. To build a barrier across the wash is that's a complete no-no in lots of people's minds. But stranger things have happened, and when sea level rise really kicks in, people might have to take a different view and work out how to how to adapt to that change. Life is all about adaptation. We've been hearing about adaptation all morning, that we're adapting to change. It's how we do that.
But we have to adapt in the right way. We need to avoid the risk of maladaptation.
Well, if only everything in life was a matter of the right way being there only being one right way. My experience in life is that usually there are a number of right ways, and it depends on what your interpretation of the right way is. You've only got to look around the world at political disturbance, and you've got two opposing people, both of whom think they are doing the right thing. We've got numbers of incidents, any kind of conflict. We've got two people, each of whom think they're doing the right thing, and can any one of them be right? I don't know.
I think that for the first stage is having a conversation. We've started a conversation this morning, which is useful to have done. But I do have a further question coming in from Roger, so I'll take that now, if I may, please, Roger.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. Yes, it's not so much it's a comment rather than a question, and a little bit of history. In fact, I worked for the Water Resources Board and the Central Water Planning Unit in the 70s, we looked at the shortage of water in this area in the southeast in general. Reservoirs were proposed initially on the peat fens, on the silt fens, and eventually they plumped for having them in the wash. Trial banks were built. They are still there today. Inter-river transfers were proposed. Desalination units somewhere near Lowestoft were proposed. This is all in the 70s. There was even going to be a nuclear power station built near Denver, and some of this water was going to cool that. None of this came to be. The Dutch were over here then advising us, and they said, why don't you build a wash barrier? They saw this as a necessity. I also worked on sea level rise. We knew sea level rise in the 70s. I asked the question several times since, what happened to all this? I mean, where these reports are never cited. They cost millions of pounds to produce. A lot of engineering work was done to prove it. When I asked the question of some of my ex-colleagues and others, they said, well, the forecast then didn't say we needed the water in the future. So a little bit of history. All this work we're talking about now was done then, and plans were made. It was just not implemented. Okay, it cost money. It cost a lot of money, but it was done. So we're in the same position again now. So let's hope this time we learn from history and say we've got to do it, else we're in trouble.
I think it's a good point to finish on terms of learning from history, but the other observation I might have been from a number of policy areas, until the imperative is so apparent and so pressing, then such serious action won't be taken. So it's a question of people all around the conversation here today to help create that imperative in an objective way, which is the basis for action. But there needs to be sufficient momentum generated in order to actually produce that kind of that action. But thank you very much, everyone, to our speakers particularly, and for the debate we've been having this morning. It's been really interesting, and to all of our speakers and all attendees, I hope you have a really great day and see you again soon. And thank you also to Peter and Helen for putting this on as ever today. Thank you all and have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Everyone, bye.
Thank you for your hard work, Martin.
Well, I kept it on time at least. Didn't have fisticuffs completely. Right, thanks very much, Lindsay. You have a great day, and thanks for putting up for the well, not putting up, but responding at the end there. That was very helpful.
I'd like that. I would have enjoyed that debate going a bit further. Actually, I've got quite a lot to say about that sort of thing. But anyway, so.
Yes, I think we were going to set the world to rights, and I've got to do that with my returning son this afternoon, so I haven't got time to do it as well.
Right. Well, good luck with that.
All right,
enjoy.
All right,
okay, thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
We've got Gareth here. Has he gone to make a cup of tea?
I thought that was pretty good today. I'm not sure how the medicines for plants fitted, except are we going to grow them all on the fens? But
I don't know. That was one of Peter's. I don't know. How did you find the plant lady, Peter? Was she
I can't remember. I'm sorry.
But it was good though. I was
interested because I set up the Cambridge Computational Biology Institute, and the man who led it was full of synthetic biology, which was just being invented then.
It was most interesting. In fact, my partner Cate is a pharmacist, and she was watching that piece of I got involved with pharmacognosia myself when I was younger, because I used to identify some of the plants the pharmacists were working on, particularly the umbellifers. And she talked about terpenoids, and the umbellifers have lots and lots of terpenoids which they use for medicine. But I suppose we couldn't.
At the beginning, she mentioned plants communicating with each other.
Mm.
I thought maybe we should try and get a talk about that.
Yes.
Yeah. There was a researcher at the Department of Chemistry, I don't know if she's still there, who was, it wasn't plants, but it was looking at, it was light and cells within the sort of eyes or in nature, but in insects, wings and eyes and things like that. But it was to do with the sort of the light elements of that and the chemical elements of that. That was, I wish I knew more about that. Maybe she's still around. Might be quite interesting. Yeah. So yeah, no, it was a good mix, but each talk was quite intense. I think there was, again, a lot of information. And what do you go away remembering other than, oh, that was quite a pleasant 2 hours, you know?
One of the good things is one of the things that has been implemented. Daniel Pullan talking about all this wet grass, and again, we discussed that in the 70s and the role of the Use Washes. The RSPB were identifying even then that the Use Washes were in trouble, and it's great to see that with the RSPB, the Wildlife Trust, and WWT that they're beginning to solve that now. So that in the history of things, that pleases me a great deal. So we're getting to grips with that.
Yeah, and this was a good talk.
Contributed to doubling nature, of course. This is what we always forecast, that a lot of these gains are going to be on agricultural land.
Yeah, and he communicated. I mean, he's a very good speaker. It was presented holistically.
Yes.
And I felt I learned my depth of understanding of the issues, and to have confidence that there are some very competent organisations and people working on this was really encouraging. So
good.
Yeah. Good.
I was slightly distracted here because I'm sitting 8 floors up and the swifts are whirling around, and there was a hobby trying to catch a swift. So it's rather
okay. Good. Well, we need we need to start thinking soon about speakers for the next one. So Roger, if you have any ideas, do throw them towards Peter and me.
A talk on swifts might be interesting.
Yes.
Because they're amazing creatures.
There are some swifts enthusiasts around. We can find out. Some local chap who makes swift boxes, and he enthuses. And there's a Swift Council Cambridge, aren't there? All sorts of things going on.
Becca had a Swift person. This was about 2 years ago that came and spoke at one of the Developing with Nature forums, and they were so yeah, they're around.
Yes, I remember that. Yes,
that was quite a good talk.
Yes, yeah.
Good. Great. Thanks, Peter.
I think I'm also thinking the next time we should have a talk on Wicken Fen, because all sorts of interesting things are going on there.
Yeah.
It always helps to keep a feature on some of the priority landscapes, doesn't it? But if we can, I don't know.
Laurie Friday, of course, wrote a book on Wicken Fen. I understand that she's going to do a rewrite. She might be someone who can talk about it.
Well, I was thinking of either Emma or John Hughes.
Well, they're in a way, I don't know. Sometimes, you could have both. You could have someone who's been involved for a long time with sort of not actually working there, but has written about it, and then the people who've got to implement it. The Emmas and the Johns, do both,
Lots of ideas.
Okay.
Thank you. Jolly good. Thanks both.
I'll upload. Yeah, good. I'll upload the recording, Peter, and let you know when it's Friday.
Good.
Good. Okay. Cheers. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.